Kia ora koutou. Hello, welcome all to our September Womeesa seminar. I'm Lorna Strachan, based at the University of Auckland. I'm a member of the Womeesa committee. This year, I'm organising our seminar series. As Womeesa is an international organisation, we wish to acknowledge Māori as tangata, whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Indigenous peoples were the first Australian and New Zealand earth and environmental scientists, and we have a lot to learn from their deep knowledge that spans tens of thousands of years. The Womeesa seminar series is about showcasing the amazing work of women in earth and environmental science in Australasia. All the recordings of past seminars are available on our website. You can sign up as a member of Womeesa to get a notification of upcoming seminars or follow us on Twitter. I am delighted to introduce our September speaker, Dr. Jenni Hopkins. Jenni is a lecturer in environmental science at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. She's originally from the UK, but came to New Zealand in 2011 to complete her PhD on the Auckland volcanic field. After completing her PhD, she's worked on numerous fixed-term postdoc projects, and her research loosely focuses on tephrochronology, volcanology, and geochemistry. But today she's going to talk to us about something a bit different. Today she's going to talk to us about why is having a family as a female academic such a difficult decision. So now it's my pleasure to hand you over to Jenni.
Thanks so much, Lorna. It's a lovely introduction, and I also wanted to thank you for the invitation to talk today. When Lorna asked me to talk, she gave no topic suggestions whatsoever, which is a joy. And I couldn't decide whether to talk about my science or to talk about something more pressing on my mind at the moment. And that is my imminent child that's coming into the world towards the end of November, which is not only terrifying, but also very exciting. But the decision to have a child as an academic is a challenging one. And it's one that has certainly taken me a number of years to actually decide it was even a viable decision. And it's something that I wanted to actually do some research into as to why this was a thing, why this was a theme. And it's actually been really fascinating to do some reading and research into various aspects of this. Certainly, this is not a deep dive. This is a very small dive into that kind of topic, and there's so much literature out there and so many different studies that it's been really challenging to try and actually synthesize things into a kind of nice coherent package. So you'll excuse me if there are definitely things that aren't covered or that I don't get into. So I wanted to just start off this first slide with a few caveats based on the work I'm going to present. So this is entirely my own opinions and my own experience. And I know there's even people within my own university that have a different experience to what I have. The research I'm putting forward is all citable. There's a reference list at the end, and I aim to put it forward in a non-biased way. I am not in any way an expert in motherhood or motherhood in academia. As this is my first child, I have not experienced this at all. So I'm just an interested party, and so it is very much my experience. And I also wanted to just recognise that once a decision is made to have a family, sometimes it isn't as quick and easy as what you would like to hope it would be. And for anyone that's in that situation, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm not going to talk about it today, but it isn't necessarily as easy as we'd all like to hope. So most of the talk, I'm kind of peppered with a few quotes and comments from papers that I've read that have really spoken to me or have really been very thematic for what I was talking about. So this is just from a study conducted in 1973, where teaching university is a very full-time job. If I had children, something would get lost in the shuffle. Can you really have both and do it well? And this just was exactly what's been ringing in my ears for probably the last 5 or 6 years, is can you do both? can you actually be successful in academia and also maintain a really good family dynamic? And another study from more recent times, the parenting penalties faced by scientist mothers. Starting a family at a key career stage comes at a cost to birthing parents, and many end up leaving the profession as a result. And again, this is something that has been preying on and has preyed on my mind throughout making these kind of decisions. So a brief outline for what I'm going to talk about today, my experience and a bit of a career timeline, although Lorna sort of covered a lot of it in her introduction. And then I'm going to look into the literature and some of the things I've found through reading about this kind of topic. So the motherhood penalty in general, and then linked directly to academia, and then the impact specifically on publication output and international collaborations. Also then going to open it up to everyone else's experience. So hopefully I'll talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and allow us about 15 minutes at the end to open it up onto the floor. So feel free to put things in the chat as we go through if anyone wants things brought up, or raise your hand at the end if you want to talk. One of the things that I will say is the subject is quite dry, and most of the research that I've read has no figures in it and very few, mostly just tables and text. So I'm going to pepper the talk with a few nice photos of volcanism in New Zealand just to kind of make it a bit more palatable. So this is a picture of me looking out over Tarawera, which is one of the most recent basaltic eruptions in New Zealand. So my career timeline and experience so far. So like Lorna said, I came to New Zealand in 2011 to start my PhD. Between 2011 to 2015 is what I'm calling the PhD years. So I was aged 23 to 27 during this time period, and that's not an unusual age range to be for doing a PhD. Between 2015 and 2021, I'm going to call that the postdoc struggle years, which all of us know very well, where we end up with multiple fixed term contracts, if we're lucky, that may be short time periods or part-time, and certainly don't necessarily feel like we're gaining any form of stability in our career. I was fortunate enough in the end of 2021 to cover a permanent staff member's parental leave, and then fortunate, although under very sad circumstances, to now be covering Linda Petherick's bereavement and covering her courses there. So those contracts were both short fixed term contracts, and in order for me to end up being eligible for parental leave in New Zealand, I had to fight for those contracts to be extended, because at Vic, in order to be qualified for parental leave, you have to have had a 12-month or more fixed term contract, which neither of my previous contracts were. So the baby is due towards the end of November, and I'm hoping to take a year's parental leave. So as I said, in New Zealand, we're lucky enough that we get 6 months government part pay parental leave, and that can be extended to 12 months of unpaid parental leave if you're in a fixed term contract of more than 12 months. At Victoria University, I think we're fortunate that as an employee of the university, you get 10 weeks paid, full pay parental leave. The slightly frustrating thing at Victoria is that if both yourself and your partner are employed by the university, you share that parental leave. So as my partner is employed at Victoria, we potentially, or we are going to have to share that parental leave, so we don't both get 10 weeks. Interestingly enough, and I definitely saw my head of school appear on the screen then, so I'm not going to be too rude about it, but neither myself and my partner have different surnames at university, so we could have been a bit sneaky and tricked the system and applied and potentially have got that through, but I don't think that would have been appropriate. So as of February next year, my current contract expires, and after that point, I no longer have a job. I will be on parental leave until the end of November, but after February 2023, my job at Victoria University doesn't exist anymore. And so I've had, even though I still have students, it's been suggested I take on an adjunct role in order to not get kicked off the system, which Vic is very good at doing, at terminating all access to the university once your contract finishes. And I've had that happen in the past. And then the future for me is a bit unknown. So when I look at these kind of quotes that say that women leave academia because they have children, that's not something that's uncommon, especially in my position where I'm on a fixed term contract, not a permanent position. So within our department, and this is certainly true for our department and something that I've seen as being quite important in my development of my thoughts on parenthood within academia, is certainly a lack of role models. And I think this is probably due to the fact that we don't have many senior female academics within our departments anyway, and that's certainly true for SGs. I'm not sure how true it is for departments in Australia, but certainly when in a science subject, we have this lack of female senior academics. And even if we do have them, not very often do we talk about our families. Do they get discussed? And I think that's because our science is the key focus. And so we don't have these kind of socially acceptable groups where families or family time are necessarily discussed. And therefore, as younger academics, we don't necessarily see that kind of role model situation shown to us within our society. Cultural perception is another thing that I've come across strongly within our department about how mothers and fathers who have commitments to their children are perceived within the department. And certainly I have overheard and been party to comments from people in relation to commitment levels of people of mothers who have had to leave early to pick children up from school, for example, whereas potentially when a father says he has to take his children to school or pick them up, it's seen quite differently. And so that cultural perspective of commitment to work is definitely judged differently for men and women. And it's something that I'm going to come back to when I talk more about the motherhood penalty. Finally, patriarchal nepotism, which is something that is clearly occurring within our department at Vic, where there are instances within the department where men get ahead because they have support from senior male colleagues and women don't. And this is true in, for example, the last 10 years or 11 years that I've been at Vic. We've had between 5 and 6 strategic hires that have all been men, and all of our newly appointed women have mostly been through open hire process. And so even just small things like that feel a little bit like women don't necessarily get the support that they need. And I do think that's linked to this lack of senior female academics within science departments. So a few more quotes, although I have to move my screen up slightly. So a study from 2008 where participants cohabited without marriage, typically postponed parenthood until they obtained doctorates and found permanent positions. And most saw having children as desirable, but the women more often viewed them as career obstacles. From another study that's been reported more recently, men and women in our survey both became parents on average at the age of 33 years old. In contrast, the average ages of parenthood in the general US population are 31 for men and 26 for women, indicating that faculty, especially women, tend to delay their transition into parenthood. And this is certainly true for a lot of people that I know of. And for example, at the age of 26, I would have been in the middle of my PhD and not in a position financially or in my mind, like stability-wise, to be wanting to have children. Another study that got published recently from the US, for many scientists, the transition from a PhD to a faculty position often happens when they're starting or building families. The researcher said, it's no wonder that many early career researchers make crucial life-altering decisions based on institutions' policies and attitudes around parenthood. And I think all of these things are very indicative of my opinion and feeling on how I've experienced this sort of transition into being a parent in academia. So that's kind of a very brief, my experience and career timeline. And so I kind of jump now into the literature, specifically talking about motherhood penalty for general and also for academics specifically. And another picture from New Zealand. This was actually a walk that we did with Juliet Sefton a few years ago now, when she completed her master's, and myself, her and my husband decided we would scale Ruapehu. So this is a view from the top of Ruapehu volcano. So this is a figure that I pulled off of Instagram from a group called Pregnant Then Screwed. And I actually pulled this off only a couple of weeks ago when I was aware I was going to be making this talk. And it basically defines the motherhood penalty, where if you look at the figure on the bottom, for families within the US who don't have children, single men and single women earn pretty much the same. Whereas the figure on the top, you can see when children are involved, it is a staggering difference between the amount of money that single men and single women make. And this in itself, as I said, defines the motherhood penalty, where mothers are significantly handicapped in terms of both their salary and also their development through a career. So just as some general pointers, and a lot of these are from the US because that seems to be where a lot of the studies come from, mothers suffer a substantial wage penalty of about 5% per child on average in the US. And if we look at that in New Zealand, just for men versus women, regardless of parental status, for every dollar that a man earns in New Zealand, it's 84 cents for a woman. And that's just on average. So in the US, for those under 35, the wage gap between mothers and non-mothers is actually larger than between men and women, which was a statistic I found really surprising, because we often think about that gendered wage gap, but actually it's more significant for mothers versus non-mothers. One of the other things that's reported is that even before you have a child, you are judged and penalized for being pregnant within the workplace, where pregnant employees are perceived as being less committed to their role, less dependable, less authoritative, and also more irrational and emotional. Hey, but we're warmer, apparently, which was reported in the article that I read, which is just great. And then once you describe yourself as a mother, you're penalized further. And this is something I'm going to talk about in more detail on the upcoming slide. But even just having that terminology within your vocabulary or on your CV seems to have a really strong impact on roles. And this is not just in academia, this is generally. And this leads to a conscious or an unconscious bias towards women in terms of promotions, hiring, and salary increase. And sadly, this is not applied to fathers. And actually, fathers sometimes benefit from being a parent. And so I found this cartoon online that I think shows this really nicely, where you have a mother and a father talking in a meeting, and the father starts off his meeting by saying, "Hi everyone, I'm a little tired today. I have a 5-month-old at home." And the audience are, "Oh, he's got a new baby, so he'll be really committed to the role and he'll be staying in the job for a while. And so he'd be a good candidate for this big project. And he's such an involved dad, and he's taken time off yesterday to go to this meeting with his child's school." Whereas a mother would be judged in a very different way. She knows she can't open her talk discussing the fact that she's a mother, or that she has children, or that she's tired because she has a teething 5-month-old at home, because people will judge her differently to a father, where we heard she's just got a new baby, so she might want to scale back her commitment, so she's not good for this big project. or she missed the PTA meeting yesterday, she's clearly overcommitted. And this is just evidence for this conscious or unconscious bias in terms of a mother being penalised against a father. And this leads to the need for women to show you are more qualified and more committed and more dependable, even with a lack of time. And this is something which then draws on your time and can lead to serious problems in terms of burnout, because you're having to prove yourself over and over again to be of a higher status than people who are working at a similar level to you. So some of the things that have been noted in the literature as to why these things occur are one of the clear things is a cultural perception. So, for example, this juxtaposition between what makes a good mother versus what makes a hard worker. And when we think about just in a societal way about what makes a good mother, it's someone who's there for their children, they're dependable, they're willing to drop everything to go and be with that child. And that doesn't equate to a hard worker in what we perceive a hard worker to be, who's not necessarily strongly committed to their role, or we can't rely or depend on them. But when you compare that to what makes a good father, and in comparison to what makes a good worker, it's quite different how as a society that's perceived, where a good father is someone who's committed to their partner, which suggests they're also going to be committed to their job, or that they're more emotionally in touch with themselves, therefore they're going to be more approachable by people who they work with. One of the other things that is brought up in the research is interruptions from work, where working part-time decreases the seniority for women and decreases their experience, and for a mother they're therefore seen as not committed to the role, whereas a father is seen as being a wonderful father and a great support to his family. So in society in general, more women than men are seen as the primary caregivers, and therefore they're more accepting of more responsibility at home, even when they both work full time. And so I think this cartoon at the bottom, well, both these cartoons really show this very clearly. The one at the bottom makes me smile because it seems fairly true in that you're running a race and women have all of these other things in front of them. And then this cartoon on the other side, which is from a book called The Mental Load, which I recommend people looking at if they're interested. And she says, "What do you mean? What did I do? I did everything. That's what I did." And so it's just this kind of inability to separate work-life balance. One of the things that I found really interesting, and this is specifically for the US, is this thing called the fatherhood premium, where actually married men in the US earn more than unmarried men. And this is something called the family wage bonus. And it's basically put in place for men to remain the breadwinners within their household, which, as you can imagine, then leads to men's jobs being seen as more important, and therefore women taking a backseat in their roles. So this is linked also to something called status characteristic theory. And this is where there is a bias towards mothers, specifically in job hiring processes, promotional processes, or salary increase. And so this is a study by Uli et al., where they put forward to an interview panel different job applications or different CVs from the same candidate. And the only thing that changed was either the gender of the candidate or if they were a mother or not a mother. And so things like their experience in the role, their level of education, the salary that they were requesting was all kept the same. So the report says, as predicted, mothers were judged as significantly less competent and committed than women without children. The competence ratings are approximately 10% lower for mothers than for non-mothers, and the commitment ratings are about 15% lower. Mothers were also held to harsher performance and punctuality standards, and mothers were allowed significantly fewer times of being late to work, and they needed a significantly higher score on a management exam than non-mothers before being considered hireable. And on top of this, the study also showed that on average, those that were mothers were offered $11,000 less as a starting salary than people exactly the same in terms of experience and qualification level than those that weren't mothers. So this is even just looking at this kind of statistic, it shows that there is this general motherhood penalty, and it's seen globally. So moving on now to looking more specifically in academia, that is to say, everything that I've spoken of so far can also be applied to academia as well. But what we see in academia is that in representation in higher education is about at parity for undergraduate levels, and this dramatically declines through academia. So this is just a figure that I pulled out from a study by Walker et al. In 2020, which shows for the top 8 New Zealand universities, the number of women in specific jobs within the academic profession. And so what you can see on here is that in the yellow line, women actually make up about 47% of the academic staff, so near parity. But as in terms of looking at the more senior levels of academics, you can see this figure decreases as associate professors end up with about 39%, and professors at about 27%. And actually, I think even within our department, it's a lot less than this when I think about the women in these positions. So in addition, in a study in 2020 by a group called Mothers in Science, they found that at an international level of over 3,000 participants, 34% of them left full-time careers in STEM subjects after they'd had their first child. And in fact, in countries where parental leave policies are poor or absent, for example, like in the US, this number was as high as 43% when pulled out to that specific value. So even in countries that have reputed gender equality in both society and academia, for example, like Scandinavian countries, having a family is still shown to impact all aspects of a woman's career trajectory. So these are just some quotes that I pulled out from the Walker study specifically for New Zealand. But this study found that female academics will be paid $400,000 less than their male counterparts throughout their entire career. And the same study found that a male researcher at a New Zealand university had more than double the odds of being ranked professor or associate professor than a woman with a similar age and research score. So this isn't even taking into account any disparity in research score based on having career breaks that having children would impact into that metric. So in general, just in terms of statistics within academia, this is a study by Brooks et al. In 1997, so quite outdated now, but it was New Zealand specific, so I thought it was worth mentioning. That academic women are more likely than their male counterparts to be single, separated, divorced, or sole parents, which is shown by the figure on the right. And academic partners are more likely to have a marriage gradient where the male or male in the partnership is of a higher status, is earning more, is more senior within the department, or is older than the woman, and therefore their role is seen as being more important and is therefore prioritized within the couple. Mothers are less likely than fathers or childless women to reach senior ranks of academia. And that's just a statistic found within multiple references. And that's shown quite clearly, for example, in the US, where tenured jobs are overpopulated with child-free women, whilst part-time contractual jobs are generally undertaken by married mothers. So here's another couple of reports to read out. Academic couples that I know with children, it still seems to be more the mother that takes on the responsibility. My sense is that having children has a much bigger impact on the mother in terms of career. Academics tend to use childcare services during working hours, but they also need substitute care in the evenings and weekends when the child is sick, and especially during conferences or research trips. Particularly, mothers talked about such dilemmas. While some could rely on care by the child's father, others depended on their mothers and friends to assist them. And that was from a study in 2008, looking at interviewing people about their perceptions of motherhood within academia. And then this other study published in 2020, recent research suggests that male academics indeed benefit from traditional gender roles by using parental leave to continue publishing. So unlike their partners who wouldn't necessarily spend that time writing papers and being productive. So although there's a whole wide range of topics on impacts of mothers, of the motherhood penalty in academia, there was two key things that I wanted to pull out that I found most interesting and had kind of expected and non-expected results. One is the impacts on publication outputs and the effects of that, and the second is the impacts on international collaborations. So impacts on publication outputs. So in general, and this is not linked in any way to marital status or whether you're a parent or not, women will publish 20% fewer publications than men in general. And as academics or people within a research profession, we know that publication outputs, sadly, are directly linked to our career progression. And that's why I've got this little image about the H-index on the right here, which is a regular source of frustration for many people within our profession, because H-indexes don't necessarily show anything other than your publication. It doesn't show how much input you put into teaching, or what your students think of you, or how you're regarded within the wider research society and community that you work within. And it's also frustrating because career breaks, regardless of whether they're to have children or not, will lead to a reduction in publication outputs. So does having children reduce your publication outputs? And actually the research shows quite mixed results here. And some studies showed no impact whatsoever. Other studies showed increased productivity post having children. And the research, it was, I think, generally difficult to maintain consistency within some parts of the research. So for example, things like the country that you're in, the discipline that you teach, that you research within, your rank within the system, and also the time period over which the study was undertaken all seem to impact your publication output scores. So this is just an example of one of the few figures that looked nice from a study I looked at from Morgan et al. In 2021, who showed that for different subjects, it had different impacts based on the publication output. So each one of these graphs shows time relative to the child's birth, so 0 being when they were born, 5 years prior and 10 years post, and then the number of publications. And what you can see, for example, for somebody researching in business, that actually the variability in terms of their publication outputs wasn't great. Whereas when you compare that to, for example, computer science, as soon as the child is born, you see this sort of divergence in publication outputs for men versus women who have children. In addition to this, the Mother in Science study that I talked about before, survey found that over time, the publication gap increases with time. And so they showed that over the course of a 15-year period, mothers publish on the order of 74 to 83% fewer papers than fathers, which when it's taken as an actual value is about 18 fewer papers over a 15-year time period. And when you think about that in terms of the amount of time it would take to make up that extra work in that deficit, it's about 5 years of extra work, which it's not surprising that that then doesn't get made up, because where do you find 5 years of extra work? So how can we look at publication outputs and what sort of things impact them? And so one of the things that I looked at was this idea of prior signals of success. So academics, it's been shown in the literature that academics that have experienced positivity prior to having children have experienced success in prior to having children, both in academic publications, research funding, are more likely to be committed to their career after having children than people who haven't had that success prior to having children. We tend to find in the literature that altered time priorities are a big thing, where having children lowers your productivity because obviously they're consuming time that would maybe be taken up with research. And also, as I said before, that work-life balance and that imbalance that we see in terms of what women will take on versus their partners. One of the other things that was shown within the literature is this idea of altered identification, where you as an academic would maybe identify as a researcher originally, and therefore you're more likely to be focused on being productive as a researcher, whereas once you become a parent, your identity shifts and you would then identify as a parent more strongly than you would a researcher, and therefore you prioritize your children over research, which is kind of not surprising. So this is just a little quote from this Yuli study linked to time priorities. And so they say, in order to negotiate work-family conflicts, women will often subordinate their careers to those of their partners and may work part-time after getting married or having children, which deters their progress into the higher strata of academia. And this, I think, is strongly linked, for example, to that level of potential career gradient, where as a woman you maybe would see your partner's role as being more important, or you would prioritize their position or their career more than you would your own. So hopefully in a slightly more positive manner, impacts on international research collaborations was something else that I wanted to look into. So one of the things that's brought up quite regularly is the benefits for those that have academic partnerships. So people whose partner is an academic as well. And that allows for a lot more parity in terms of understanding of positions and different aspects of the job, where academic partners tend to be able to support their partners more in terms of international travel. Studies have shown that for academic partners, actually, they have a more equitable work-life balance and take on roles in a more gender-balanced way in the home. And that's in comparison to women who have children and have a partner who's full-time employed outside of academia, who have a much lower chance of being able to be involved in international research collaborations, because they just don't have the ability to travel or to have that time off or extended time off to be able to go abroad, for example. But in saying that, this reliance on the ability to travel to conferences or for example, on extended research leave can act as a bit of a glass fence for female academics, where it could be seen as being able to do it, but there are multiple things that stop you being able to do those things that aren't necessarily thought of. One of the things that's shown within the literature is that financial status can heavily impact these kind of international research collaborations, where your seniority within your department or research grant success can allow you to travel more or less often. And if we think back to what I've just discussed in terms of paper outputs, one of the things that's interesting is if your productivity is reduced, your research grant success is reduced, and therefore your ability to gain the financial means by which to travel can be reduced. So I think overall the reduced number of women in these kind of senior roles in academia breeds this kind of vicious cycle for collaborations as well, because men continue to preferably seek out men as collaborators because women are either not there, not as high profile, or are maybe seen as being less reliable or less able to travel, for example, because of family commitments. So I put together this little kind of metric which shows a bit of a review of what I've just talked about in terms of how I see it. Again, this might not be other people's experiences. But so, for example, you take time off, and it doesn't have to be to have children, it could be just in general. And this means that your productivity is reduced. You lose time in active research. So, for example, being in the field or being in the lab, or if you're in a science subject. You lose time in networking and collaboration, both nationally and internationally, and even just within your department. And you lose time in fostering student relationships, where certainly within our department, student relationships develop over the course of that student being within the system. The metrics through which we're judged, so for example, our H index does not necessarily reflect directly the time off for parental leave. And because of that, we're less likely to be competitive and therefore receive research funding, less attractive as research collaborators, and less competitive within the job market itself. As a result, we need to work harder to appear more competitive to our male counterparts, or to build our publication record back up, which is an unenviable task that you would probably never be able to do when we talk about the numbers. And as a result of that, we're pushed into taking additional teaching and service roles on top of research roles, which again loses time and loses focus in terms of the research. So just to finish off before I conclude, this pulled out again from this Walker study seemed to kind of say it all to me, specifically for New Zealand, but I think this could be linked worldwide. If New Zealand universities continue to measure academic success based on the assumption of a linear, straightforward career path, then any deviations will continue to disadvantage women. So some key conclusions from what I've just said. The motherhood penalty is real, and it strongly impacts women in academia. Women in academia typically postpone having children until they have career stability. But having a partner who is also an academic reduces the impact of the motherhood penalty. And in addition, having success prior to having children, which is also likely linked to postponing having children until later in their career, increases the likelihood of continued success post having children in academia. And so I also wanted to just finish up, although because I feel like this has been quite a negative talk, and I think a lot of people are going to want to go and have a glass of wine or something now because it all seems quite horrible. I wanted to finish up with just some thoughts on what we can do to try and make it better for our for women in science. And I've put up the link here for Mothers in Science, which is a group that are really supportive of mothers in science and developing that kind of ability to promote mothers in science. But these are just some thoughts from my own head. Including women more often in our research groups, addressing our own unconscious biases when it comes to employing mothers and women, and being mindful of whether we have those unconscious biases. Taking into account that parental leave when assessing applications isn't necessarily a one-for-one take. If you've had 1 year parental leave, it doesn't necessarily equate to 1 year of lost productivity. Changing our perception that flexible working is not slack working. And I think COVID's done a lot of good things for that, where people now work at home, they don't work at home, which I think has been very good in terms of our cultural perception. Increase our support for parents traveling overseas to conferences, which is certainly something that's becoming more apparent in terms of a lot of the conferences I've been involved in, is there always seems to be now this ability to support parents, or parents traveling to conferences, which is great. And finally, being mindful of when organising meetings that may conflict with parenting responsibilities, which I think sometimes is easy to overlook when you're not a parent yourself, but is a really frustrating thing probably when you are a parent and someone puts a meeting at before 10 o'clock maybe, or after 3. So yeah, that's it from me.